So it's 3 p.m. Perfect. So good afternoon. I'm very pleased to see all of you again after the morning session yesterday morning. I know that you had this morning two intense sessions. So I propose we continue on the same rhythm to start this third session today on this important, maybe too abstract concept of polarization in the world. So to organize this session, we have three excellent young leaders with us. Adam Coy on my left, a research fellow on the ChinaMed project, and PhD student in sinology at, sorry for the pronunciation, but Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest. We have also Danielle Piatkiewicz, Deputy Chief Operating Officer at the Alliance of Democracies Foundation. And last, Juraj Majcin, again, sorry for the pronunciation, policy analyst at the European Policy Center in Brussels. So we have 1 hour half together, so please come in. And to introduce this session, so you receive three very general questions, and I'm going to present. So I propose that we have like three different moments to address these three questions, and we will keep a while for general discussion. I will open the floor to receive your comment and maybe also your points of view on this important concept. I mean, I didn't present myself, but I'm Martial Foucault, director of the IRSEM, new director, and also professor of political science at Sciences Po. And as political scientist, the concept of polarization came into our debates maybe 10, 15 years ago. And when we talk about polarization, it was most of the time about partisan polarization. This debate initiated in the US between Democrats and Republicans at the Congress. And now we see, I mean, social scientists are very innovative because we have a new generation of concept of polarization. Affective polarization, partisan polarization, but also emotional polarization. So we see that year after year, a new concept with polarization is emerging. So we are not going to define concretely and objectively polarization this afternoon, but I just want to frame our discussion around polarization and foreign policy, but also defense and security policy. Most of the time we know that, I mean, scholars are focusing on the effect of polarization on foreign policy. But we don't really address the opposite relationship. To what extent the perception of external threats could affect, for instance, partisan polarization. And for what we observe in Europe, I think that we should keep in mind the two directions of this relationship between polarization and foreign and security and defense policy. So, in my view, and I see that many papers now have been published on this domain on foreign policy and polarization, I would say that we should enlarge the scope by discussing I mean, the divide between democracies and non-democracies, polarization, and foreign policy. I see the three blocks that interact each other. Just to give you an element for, for introducing the first round of discussion and leave the floor to our young leaders. Democracy are traditionally thought to have many advantages in foreign affairs relative to non-democracies. They are better at keeping, for instance, foreign policy consistent despite regular leadership turnover. And in France, you are very lucky this week to be in France to observe this movement. That's what many scholars call stability advantage for democracies. Whatever the change, the democracies as institutions are better than any person in charge of foreign policy. The second advantage is about credibility. Credibility because democracies are supposed to signal information to enemies or adversaries. Okay? And the last advantage is about reliability. Reliability because democracy are supposed, again, to maintain their international commitments compared to non-democracies. So from this starting line, I would like to get your views, your insights on the first element of this discussion about polarization. In your view, to what extent is global polarization, but you may focus on different regions, to what extent is global polarization driven by political leaders versus citizens? Because we have this debate about populism, the real people against elites, but in terms of polarization, what does it mean? And are democracies willing to counter, to fight polarization effectively? In a sense, is polarization a danger for democracies and the way to handle, to manage foreign policies? You don't have 3 hours for that, but so I'll leave you, the time you need in a first round of discussion, and after we will continue with my second general question. So how do we want to proceed? Adam, you want to be the first, or?
In case the lady would not have to, wouldn't want to take the initiative, I would gladly start.
So you are 3, we have 3 questions, so you can imagine we will be the first this time, the first, the second time, and the third time, if you agree with that. Exactly. So please, Adam.
All right, so, oh yes. Thank you very much. I don't know if everyone can hear me, even at the back of the hall. Wonderful, thank you. So, thank you very much for Professor Foucault for the kind invitation and also the introduction in the beginning of this panel. I'm Adam Coy, a member of the ChinaMed project from the University of Turin. Just a few more introductory lines before I start my take on this very interesting question. Just for you, the audience, to see my where is my starting point and where is my baseline upon looking at this question. So what I essentially do at ChinaMed is I'm a member of this very diverse group of young researchers who cover Sino-Mediterranean interactions, and here in Mediterranean I refer to the wider Mediterranean area. That means that we have researchers who cover south of Europe, North Africa, the Gulf region, and the Middle East. So I'm particularly the person who covers China. So from the ChinaMed part, I'm the China guy, and so it's just for you to. And what we are essentially doing is we analyze mostly based on, we analyze Sino-Mediterranean relations through discourse analysis and qualitative analysis. And this is for, this is important for you to know, because I rarely have the need to address questions that are this much abstract and academically articulated. So most of the time what I have to do is much more, how should I say, much more about the currencies, much more about media reactions with regards to spotlight issues. So this is my baseline for this at the beginning of this discussion. But nonetheless, when I received the questions for this panel, I realized that despite it's gonna be something very different to what I'm regularly have to do, it still gives me the opportunity to exercise some kind of scholarly insight on my own thinking process. And I realized that much of these so-called fundamental notions that I use through my scholarship at looking at Chinese Mediterranean interactions, I have some fundamental notions that I don't call into question necessarily all the time. So this opportunity now is a time when I had to call my own assumptions into question, and essentially what I have come up with is that I decided that here I'm gonna be a sort of like a deconstructionist. So I'm going to, if I may, I may dissect the question to smaller parts and look into what are the underlying assumptions behind the formulation of question in the manner of which Professor Foucault have just asked. So in your question, you sort of proposed like a citizen versus politician dynamics as a primary dynamics between in the matter of polarization, and also with that you have sort of assumed or that maybe without a strong central player who is either like driving or enhancing polarization, polarization would not occur. And I would fundamentally challenge the characterization of polarization in this manner, because arguably polarization is driven by a range of factors. So first of all, we have maybe wealth distribution problems, inequalities, shrinking middle class dynamics within the society, our general habits of using social media, technological, and with that, of course, technological advancements, interstate cultural divisions. I assume that these underlying factors are all playing a part in the big picture of polarization. And given that these prerequisites of polarization exist, I think these create a possibility for state or non-state actors to really enhance or incentivize upon polarization, and here I think we may end up putting up different categories like state, intrastate, like state versus citizen dynamics, state versus state dynamics even. So I think I will not go into detail about these. Nonetheless, I think I think there are multiple angles to these dynamics to be uncovered, and I don't know if I'm going to have opportunity to really bring in the Chinese perspective in the three range of questions for this panel. But at least what I have had in mind while preparing to this panel is that with the cooperation of my fellow panelists, I will try to do my best to highlight a possible Chinese perspective in this bigger question of polarization. So I think maybe I will pass the microphone at this point to a fellow panelist, and maybe once everyone have addressed the basic question, I would gladly go back and have another take on the China-specific dynamics of this question. And thank you very much for attending this panel with us.
Thank you, Adam. So, Danielle, if you want to continue.
Yes, so I mean, one thing just to start off with, I mean, coming from this perspective of a kind of examining transatlantic studies and relations, I'm going to try my best attempt to understand the psyche of my fellow Americans in what we view as kind of the latest effects of polarization when it becomes quite politicized. One thing, just also reflection on the last two sessions we had earlier today, is that, of course, polarization was something that kind of kept coming up in the sense of the areas that it's starting to permeate into, climate, security, religion, science. I mean, polarization is what we're seeing kind of on a larger scale. But in regards to the U.S., I'll try my best to take an unbiased perspective on this. But what I see is that, of course, is driven by both political leaders, and often then political leaders give citizens and specific citizens the mandate to continue to do that, to emphasize the polarization. But I would also say that the role of a third actor, and of course what we see now in certain countries is autocratic pressures seeking to undermine democracy and rule of law. We've seen this with China, with Russia, and especially in regards to Europe and the US. Maybe inspired a little bit about my fellows these last couple of days, I decided to go back to a little bit more of my academic background as well, and go back, and I'm just thinking of course, if you're thinking of Huntington and Clash of Civilizations, looking at ideological disorder, we have polarization essentially occurs, I wouldn't want to use the word naturally, but it does occur, of course, in societies, especially when you have multicultural and globalization at the scale that we have today. However, the changes that we see now is the way it's amplified. We have the role of social media that you've outlined some of these areas, and it's mainly the way that politicians are using to leverage power and political influence. And in the US, we see that this drive has kind of created these, and I think Daniela earlier said it in her session, was the haves and have-nots. I think we're seeing really clear divisions in the United States around this, around race, around white-lashing, wokeism. It's I refer to this book called from Justin Guest, The Rise of a New Minority. Highly recommend it to anybody, where he was examining these trends before Brexit, before the United States 2016 election of Trump 1.0, where he was basically saying we see these societal shifts, and that's mainly some of the reasons we see why people voted for Trump this year, which was border invasion, media distortion, his proven track record of not engaging any wars, putting money essentially back into people's accounts, and of course of looking through inflation acts, and even though during the Biden administration employment was up, but the inflation of course affected that, but one could argue that a little bit was tied to Trump administration. But in the United States in particular, I mean, we're looking at a country that has a two-party system. Of course, we're going to have natural polarization. But if you want to look back at even the United States in itself, it's rooted in a distrust of political systems. I mean, we had our Revolutionary War, for any of our UK colleagues here. If you look at Madison and Hamilton, I mean, they feared democratic decision-making would become a mob rule. And so what we see now is kind of populism and polarization are starting to be rooted even more distinctly in the United States, and rooting to distrust. When I think back to the kind of the role of the elections, which is of course an active means and propagator of sometimes polarization, we see 2016 US elections where we of course were blaming a lot of foreign influence. 2020 we blamed domestic influence. Now things have changed a little bit. 2024, no one else to blame. We can only now kind of blame ourselves. We need to really, we did not see what was kind of shaping this kind of new minority that's really emerging from the United States. And I think we also undermined the power of personality politics. I know we discussed this over lunch today, but Trump and of course other populist leaders kind of transcend rationality and they also are not held to the same standards. I mean, I don't even want to get into what that means, of course, with his indictments and all these different things. But of course, these have been quite politicized on both sides. Leaders are often using the system. So this kind of goes to your point of kind of what is propagating what. And I do think the electoral system in the United States, the way that we do our term limits, the checks and balances, I do think that there are some fractures in our system that are not really leading to a healthy democracy where it allows polarization to really take root there. Now, what can we do about this? I definitely don't have the magic wand, but I would say democracy has actually, unfortunately, become a bit of a negative word in some of the areas. And instead, I do think we, and especially in civil society, need to focus a bit more on rule of law. I think that's an area that you can kind of transcend and maybe try to find some areas. Address the amplification of misinformation that often create further polarization, and really a multi-stakeholder approach to solving some of these issues. I do think businesses and tech companies and social media platforms need to be held a bit more responsible for their role in propagating polarization in the United States. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Danielle. Juraj.
Thank you. And thank you, Professor Foucault, for a nice introduction. Also, thank you for organizing the program and for inviting me to also share my thoughts on polarization. So, a similar way as Adam and Danielle, I'm not an expert on polarization. I'm not a sociologist. I work on European security and defense policy, mostly focusing on European industrial, defense technological industrial base. And mobilizing personnel for European armies and access to finance for defense. So we not really deal with polarization every day, but coming from Brussels, sometimes you feel that you're a bit disconnected, where you have this shield of EU's democratic deficit. And then I feel like we already had third report, we had Letta report, we had Draghi report, we had Minister report. We exactly know we have recipe what we are supposed to do to change Europe for the better. But then you have discussions with politicians from member states, and then you say, yeah, but we know what to do, but we don't know how to get elected next day. And I think it's pretty much related to the issue of polarization. So I think, I'm not an academic, so if I can use academic language, so I think also it's responsibility of epistemological communities to think about polarization, to think how can we reach out to audience, that communicate our ideas to people that usually would not probably follow our thoughts. And that's why I advocated many times in our think tank that we should change a bit our strategy. Our audience is not solely policymakers, but also wider audience. So using more social media. But then, of course, we struggle with, it requires a lot of resources, so we don't have the means. So just to present you also my baseline, where I come from. And, polarization, I think democracies are, and you mentioned that democracies are naturally polarized, and especially in the US, where you have a two-party system, but also in multi-party systems. You see the polarization growing. I think a bit of polarization is natural, and democracy can withstand it as long as we have exchange mechanisms, communication mechanisms between the two groups and channels by which we can resolve our differences. The problem is when politicians leverage this polarization, these divisions, and don't do anything about with the objective of reaching the other side, to bridge the difference, and most importantly, where they do not view the other side, and I just don't mean only their political opponents, but also, and it happens to, and I'll give you a short example from my country, Slovakia, when they see the other group as the enemy to destroy, not the rival to win over, but someone that needs to be destroyed. That ideas we can't take on board. And just to give you an example, I'm probably aware we recently in Slovakia had this unhappy incident with assassination attempt of our prime minister, and really the country was in shock. Nothing like that happened in Slovak history, and everyone was wondering what the prime minister's reaction would be. It was almost a year after quite harsh electoral campaign. And you know, the thing is that when it happened in a small town in Slovakia, but then when there was a session of the parliament, and the vice chair of the Slovak National Assembly said, you know, Prime Minister Fico has been shot, you know, and then talking to the opposition, he said, this is of your making, this is your fault, you have blood on your hands. So, and that we ended with we started right with such a divisive rhetoric, even in a situation like this, which require building bridges. And even today, now, our Prime Minister says this was not I forgive the attacker, which was, by the way, a quite mentally unstable, confused senior citizen, absolutely no political motivations whatsoever. He said, no, I forgive the man, but it's the opposition that's responsible for that. He was just the extended hand of the opposition. And I think it's really bad. And this you see where you can end up when politicians leverage this, because it's very easy. It's usually based on fear of the other, and fear is primary emotions, which can be really exploited. So I think it's important that politicians don't exploit this and withstand this temptation, because it's quite easy to do negative campaign. This would be my intro. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your effort to think about polarization, even if you indicated that you are not necessarily expert on that domain, but I think that you, in 20 minutes, you were able to identify precisely that we are not really comfortable with any definition about polarization. If we think about electoral system with two-party system, for sure, we should have and we have polarization, but what does it mean for multi-party systems, as some countries in Europe? You indicated as well that polarization could overlap other dimensions as inequalities distribution. You mentioned also social media, and it covers, if we think about who to blame in 2020 or 2016 in US, but it also some policies. And I would like, for the second round of exchanges, I would like to start from what you said. You have emphasized some dimensions as climate change, religion, security, or border protection. So we see that we have some domestic policies for which polarization may occur easily because partisan views are more and more divided on such issues. But now, because we are there at École Militaire, and we would like to know whether polarization may affect the way by which countries run their foreign or security policies. And the second part of this panel is to make this effort to think about international relations, and because we know that some people, some scholars argue that polarization accelerates competition between great powers, but not necessarily for democracies. Okay, I'm not saying that polarization is the evil for democracies, but for authoritarian countries, the issue of polarization is not so prominent or so relevant. So from an international relations perspective, would you say that polarization is able to revive the concept of realism or neo-realism, the influence of great powers, and we think about international order according to powers, and among them military power, or do you see a new approach in terms of international relations regarding polarization? And I try to be much clearer. I was wondering whether polarization could reduce two of the advantages I indicated in my introduction in terms of credibility and stability advantages for democracies. Democracy more and more polarized, does it mean that they will lose in terms of stability, lose in terms of credibility in the way to build, to shape a new international order? Sorry, it's a very large question. I know that, but I'm very interested to know from your perspective and from the place where you are, the position you have, how do you observe, perceive this new change in the world? Please. Please, Adam, because if you want to go back on your Chinese...
Actually, we can, I believe, at this stage we can skip it, and I will maybe make some references when we touch upon it.
Excellent, and we will have a discussion, general discussion, so
anyways, yes.
I don't forget that for the last part.
Sure. So, one major thing that you have mentioned is the possible revival of like realism or neo-realism in international relations, and I believe with regards to China there is no use for any kind of revival because it has been the Chinese elite have never stopped to be subscribed to the realist understanding of or the approach of international relations. And with that being said, the CCP, whether we look at Mao Zedong's foreign policy or following the reform and opening up, Deng Xiaoping's reform policy, or more recently Xi Jinping's foreign policy, I think we see a continuation of this notion that the Chinese leadership continuously sees itself operating in a sort of hostile environment externally, and this notion have been also reinforced following the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the following so-called like chaotic period or like the chaotic system change within the post-communist states and especially in Russia. So I think the CCP have learned some lessons in these historic moments, and these lessons all made them revisit the traditional realist look on international relations. And more recently, Xi Jinping's approach is also reinforced by US efforts to contain China, obviously, and as we see more and more areas of competition being securitized between Sino-American and Sino-Western cooperation, I think this kind of outlook further cement this perception within the Chinese leadership. And also, yesterday we have, I would like to point back to a discussion we had yesterday about so-called researcher biases. And I think even us researchers are sometimes buy into certain concepts that are just not very much well-based, actually. So I don't know if I may do a little test here, but can I ask everyone to raise your hand if you believe that the United States, the influence of the United States is globally decreasing? Hands up, please. Influence, yes. All right. And secondly, China's influence is on the rise. All right, thank you. So the thing is that what does these two questions mean? Oftentimes, I think these scholars tend to be fascinated by the logic of neo-realism and its fascination about the distribution of global power. And there is this ongoing talk about whether the center of global economy is shifting towards more Asia and not. And oftentimes this triggers a sort of zero-sum game logic within us. And I think this makes us forget about the complexity of Chinese bilateral and multilateral engagements, and make us believe that, for instance, the region I'm particularly active in looking at is the Middle East. And there has been, in particular in the Middle East, there has been this ongoing debate whether the United States is preparing for a more substantive exit from the United States, and whether that would automatically mean that China will fill up some rooms there. And I think the fundamental the fundamental problem is that we skip the analysis part of looking at what are the Chinese capabilities, what are the perspective of the local actors, and we just exercise this kind of oversimplifying logic that the United States decrease automatically will mean China's rise in the region. And I'm fundamentally not subscribing into this kind of logic and approach. And I believe that China's capabilities and even China's goals are fundamentally different vis-a-vis the Middle East or other areas of the international arena. So I think we have to be mindful of whether we are assuming some kind of binary logic where we shouldn't be. And I think I have been suggesting that and another bias that I would like to highlight is that oftentimes scholarship overvalues the notions of shifts and changes at the expense of looking at ongoing continuities. This has been also something which is especially true in the relation with China. So, but I still have some how should I say, novelties to talk about in China's approach to, for instance, multilateralism, because although China's look has been especially realist in relation to multilateralism, very pessimistic, very passive, this has been one of the areas where actually there is an evolution in China's attitude towards multilateralism. So especially what we see in the Gulf and some of the small multilateral arrangements, we see that China have facilitated a lot of accessions. We can look at BRICS, we can look at the Shanghai Cooperation Forum, we can look at BRI, we can look at China facilitating Chinese diplomacy having a higher focus on the Middle East and turning the Middle East effectively to a sort of laboratory of Chinese diplomacy. But nonetheless, I think again, this would be a very tricky thing to assume that with these changes and accessions and expansions, this also automatically means a sort of bloc versus bloc logic. I fundamentally disagree that we should simply buy into this kind of rationale, although of course the domestic narration of these events in China, of course, is very happy to characterize this kind of developments in a manner of like expansion of Chinese influence into various areas. So I could talk about a lot of things. I could talk about Xi Jinping's various initiatives and shared future of mankind and all these troops of Chinese diplomacy. But I think I'm gonna stop here, and maybe if there is a question from the audience, I'm very happy to revisit either of these. And again, I will pass the mic.
Thank you. Please, Danielle. Michel?
One thing I would maybe expand on something you mentioned was not just looking at influence, but credibility. I think these are going to be very different things when we're looking at the spread, and because of course you're going to have China in various regions, but influence and there's always a lot of strings attached, and I'm curious of how, granted you can also argue that the United States had that a long time ago too, but mainly to your question on kind of what accelerates competition among great powers. In the work I see in a little bit more thinking, and this is a good exercise, I have to say, to kind of think abstractly of these kind of traditional viewpoints, is that political polarization has in my original viewpoint, was always mutually exclusive to great power competition. In both that it reaffirms and challenges kind of those classic theories of classism and realism and neorealism, but I would say more and more we see polarization undermining multilateral cooperation, where states are starting to prioritize their own survival and relative powers, and this is kind of going into a rebalancing and kind of bandwagoning of different initiatives, and I see this kind of just amping up when we're starting to call into question some of these multilateral institutions. Are they still what they originally were supposed to be? You know, of course, Ukraine, you know, has kind of given renewed value to NATO, but there's a lot of these kind of conditionalities beforehand that we really haven't thought fundamentally what they mean in the longer term. And I do think they're becoming more and more politicized. One thing I, as I said, was kind of inspired by the session to kind of think back through some of the, you know, literature that's out there that I kind of was referring to in my first time when 2016, the kind of the rise of Trump, if you will, was Robert Kaplan came out with this book called The Forest Grows Back, and he had said, true realism understands history. The natural state of world is chaos, not order. And I think we have to be reminded that democracy is not the norm. It is actually the exception, and that without kind of continuously to feed into these democratic values that bind us, that and kind of counteract some of these polarization tendencies, we're going to fall back into that state of chaos. And so there needs to be some balance there. So I just wanted to say that these are kind of bigger picture things that I don't think we're going to have the answer. But if we kind of leave it unattended, as he says, the jungle will grow back and reemerge even stronger, and actors will kind of reemerge left unchecked.
Thank you. Please, Juraj.
Thank you. Beware of the use of the word jungle. You know, Mr. Borrell got into hot water after he described the world as a jungle. No, just was a joke, of course. Yeah. No, I mean polarization, and I really like this link, this idea between polarization and whether it has any impact on transforming the nature of international system to more in a more neorealist way. I think. There's a temptation to say yes, but on the other hand, neoliberalism relies on microeconomics in terms of thinking of states as rational actors, and I think that what we're seeing is opportunism and sort of transactional relations rather than pure neoliberalism, because of course you can easily translate this distrust of the other that I was talking about also to the international level. So I don't trust the other party, the opposition. So I also might have some more reservations with regards to outside countries, and of course it will affect one state's attitude on multilateral institutions. I would also, however, highlight that there is also the multilateral institutions are attacked from both sides. So on the one hand, of course, we have far right, but also on the far left side of the spectrum, there is and I'm of course not academic. I assume that, however, my colleagues in the audience, of course, know better than I do. And yesterday we discussed a lot about critical theories of international relations, but you have a lot of streams of thought saying that international organizations like International Monetary Funds, WTO, or even NATO, if we can talk about that, are Western constructs. And norms on which they rely are oppressive, so we should also not work with them. So I think polarization as it currently stands is naturally geared against multilateralism. But what I think what we see in reality is this opportunism. And I can also refer to a book by Anne Applebaum, Autocracy Incorporated, where you see that countries that would have, from the IR perspective, really school, quite opposing interests. The leaders are bandwagoning, are coming together and forming a bloc to advance their interests. And also, just coming from Slovakia, you would say that Viktor Orban, with his policy of Greater Hungary, which goes against Slovak national interest, because he often, Hungarian officials have maps that include also Slovakia there, and you would expect Slovak governments to do something about it, while our prime minister's his greatest ally is Viktor Orban. So I see this more as a transaction. Also, maybe it goes deeper, more on the personal level of policymakers that seek their autocratic counterparts for their specific gains. And it's also maybe true for Donald Trump. When he was asked whether he would defend Taiwan, the response was pretty transactional, although it would be against U.S. interest to have Taiwan invaded by China, but also Russia, to have NATO, to have Russia attacking NATO, because of course it's not in the U.S. interest to have one power dominating the whole continent. While of course, if Trump or someone else of these autocrats, think they got a good deal, they might be satisfied with it. So I think it also goes more to the personal level rather than purely from the purely IR perspective. So this would be my take. Thank you.